Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand on a flat plain so vast and so still that the horizon seems to curve at the edges? To look down at your own hands and know that the clay beneath your fingernails carries the memory of 5,000 years of human intention, that the field you are standing in was once the garden of a god, tended by families whose names were pressed into tablets that still sleep in the earth beneath your feet. Picture for a moment a night in that ancient land, the air warm and faintly sweet with the smell of the river, the stars so close and so numerous that the darkness between them seems thin, almost transparent, and somewhere in the reeds a night bird calls once and then falls silent, and the world is so quiet that you can hear the water moving in the canal beside the field, a soft and steady sound that has been making that same sound for longer than any human memory reaches. If these late journeys into the deep past bring you comfort or quiet your mind as the day winds down, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Do it only if it genuinely helps you rest or satisfies some quiet curiosity that lives in you. And if you feel moved to share where you are in the world tonight, drop a comment below with your location and the hour. It is a small and lovely thing, knowing that people in 100 different places are listening to the same story under different skies. Dim the lights now if you have not already done so. Let the room grow soft around you. If there is a fan nearby, let it run at its lowest setting, that gentle hum that asks nothing and offers only the steady presence of white noise. Pull the covers a little closer if the night is cool. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders release whatever they have been holding since morning. There is nothing required of you now but to listen. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. The land we return to tonight is the same land we have visited before, that wide and ancient plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, but tonight we enter it from a different angle, moving not through the broad sweep of political history, but through something quieter and more intimate, something that the scholars who have spent their lives with the clay tablets understand, but that is harder to communicate than the names of kings and the dates of battles. Tonight we move through the inner world of the great families themselves, through the texture of their daily existence, through the patterns of thought and practice that made them not merely powerful but enduring, not merely prominent in their own time but present, in some form, across all the long centuries that followed. The concept of a great family in the ancient Sumerian world was not the same as the modern concept of a dynasty, though it overlapped with it in certain ways. A dynasty, as we tend to use the word, refers primarily to a succession of rulers, a chain of power passing from parent to child within a single lineage. The great families of Sumer were something more diffuse and more resilient than this. They were networks, webs of connection that extended horizontally across a generation, as well as vertically through time, taking in not only the direct line of descent but the cousins and the in-laws and the adoptees and the clients, and the dependents who attached themselves to the family's orbit. A great Sumerian family was less like a chain and more like a root system, spreading out in many directions beneath the surface, finding purchase in multiple places, able to survive the cutting of any single root because the others continued to sustain the whole. This quality of diffuse resilience was not accidental. It was cultivated deliberately over generations by families that understood very well the precariousness of their position and the importance of maintaining multiple sources of support. A family that depended entirely on the favour of a single ruler was a family one political crisis away from ruin. A family that had sons in the temple administration and sons in the palace administration, and sons managing the family's private estates and daughters married into the great families of 3 or 4 other cities, was a family that could absorb shocks, that could lose one branch without losing the whole, that could redirect its energies when one avenue closed by finding another that was still open. The marriages that the great families arranged were the most important single mechanism for building and maintaining this resilient web. The negotiation of a marriage between 2 great families was a serious undertaking conducted by the senior members of both families, with the careful attention to detail that one would give to a major commercial transaction, which in a sense it was. The terms of the marriage agreement covered the bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, the dowry brought by the bride into the new household, the rights of the bride's family to visit and maintain contact with their daughter, the conditions under which the marriage could be dissolved, and the disposition of property in the event of the husband's death. All of this was set down in writing, witnessed by respectable members of both families, and sometimes by representatives of the temple, and kept in the family archive alongside the other documents that recorded the family's property and its legal history. The wedding itself, when it finally took place, was a celebration that the whole neighbourhood would have been aware of, a day of feasting and music and the exchange of formal gifts, a day when the two families displayed their wealth and their social connections to each other and to the wider community. The bride, dressed in her finest clothes and adorned with the jewellery that was part of her dowry, would be escorted from her father's house to the house of her new husband in a procession that moved through the streets of the city, watched by the neighbours who had gathered at their doorways to observe. There would be songs, composed for the occasion or drawn from the repertoire of wedding hymns that the professional musicians knew, celebrating the beauty of the bride, the good fortune of the groom, the blessings of the gods on the new household. The feasting would continue into the night, the guests eating and drinking the food and beer that the hosting family had spent days preparing, and when the celebration was over and the guests had gone home and the new couple was alone in the house of the husband, the real work of the marriage would begin. The slow, patient work of building a shared life and a shared household, and eventually a new generation to carry the family forward. The children born of these marriages were welcomed with ceremonies that acknowledged their entry into both the human community and the divine order. A new baby in a great Sumerian family was not merely a private joy but a public event, a demonstration that the family continued, that the gods had not withheld their blessing from this generation, as they had from so many others. The birth was attended by a midwife, a woman with specialized knowledge of the herbs and techniques that could ease a difficult labor, and by the women of the family, who kept watch through the night and offered prayers to the goddesses of childbirth. If all went well, the baby was washed and wrapped in cloth and placed in the arms of its father, who gave it its name, a name that was often chosen to honor the family's divine patron, or to commemorate some event or hope, a name that announced the family's identity and its aspirations for this new life. The naming of children in ancient Sumer was a matter of considerable significance, because names were understood to have power to shape the character and destiny of the person who bore them. The names given to children of the great families often contained the name of a god, a practice called theophoric naming, in which the divine name was combined with a word meaning "my god is," or "the god has given," or "the god is king." These names were not merely pious declarations. They were statements of relationship, claims that this particular family stood in a special connection to this particular deity, that the god's protection and favour extended to this child, and through the child to the family as a whole. Over generations, the consistent use of theophoric names built up a tradition that was itself a kind of genealogy, a record in miniature of the family's religious history and its divine patronage. The education of these children, once they were old enough to leave the immediate orbit of their mothers, was a process that began earlier than we might imagine and continued for many years, blending practical instruction in the skills of daily life with formal training in the scribal arts and the religious traditions that formed the intellectual world of the Sumerian elite. A boy of a great family might begin his formal schooling as young as 5 or 6 years old, sitting in the courtyard of the family home in the early morning, a clay tablet on his knee, a stylus in his hand, practicing the basic marks of cuneiform under the watchful eye of an older tutor, a retired scribe or a younger member of the family who had been trained in the tablet house and was now earning his keep by passing the knowledge on. The first lessons were purely mechanical, learning to hold the stylus correctly, to press the wedge-shaped tip into the clay at the right angle and with the right amount of pressure to produce the standard marks, to form the basic signs with the consistency and legibility that would be expected of a trained scribe. This took months of practice, hours of repetition each day, the student's fingers growing sore at first and then calloused, the marks on the tablets gradually improving from the shaky, uneven impressions of a beginner to the confident, regular strokes of someone who had internalized the technique. There was no shortcut. The body had to learn the skill as thoroughly as the mind, until pressing the marks into clay was as natural and unconsidered as walking. Once the basic technique was mastered, the student moved on to the content, the lists of signs and their meanings, the standard texts that every educated person was expected to know by heart, the proverbs and the hymns, and the mythological compositions that formed the shared intellectual heritage of Sumerian civilization. The tablet house curriculum has been reconstructed by scholars from the thousands of practice tablets that students made, tablets that were used for a lesson, and then recycled, the clay smoothed over and the tablet reused, but that sometimes survived because a student's work was preserved alongside the finished tablets of the archive. These practice tablets show us the progression of the curriculum from the basic sign list to the more complex literary and religious texts, and they sometimes preserve the corrections of the teacher, marks made in the clay to show the student where a sign was malformed or a word miscopied. The proverbs that students copied were among the most charming and revealing of the texts in the curriculum, short observations about human behaviour and the ways of the world that seem, across the distance of 5,000 years, surprisingly familiar. A lazy man does not plant seeds in spring and then weeps in autumn, one such proverb says, in a paraphrase of the sense rather than a direct translation. Another observes that the dog that wanders far from home does not find good food. Another notes that a man who builds his house without a proper foundation will regret it when the rain comes. These were not merely literary exercises. They were the crystallized wisdom of a long civilized people, the practical philosophy of a society that had learned, through many generations of experience, what worked and what did not, what could be trusted and what must be treated with caution, how to navigate the complicated social world of a Sumerian city with intelligence and prudence. The mythological texts that the students copied gave them something else, a shared imaginative world, a set of stories and images and divine figures that they held in common with every other educated person in the Sumerian world, a cultural vocabulary that made communication across the boundaries of different cities and different families possible, because everyone understood the references, everyone knew the story of Inanna's descent to the underworld, everyone knew the exploits of Gilgamesh, everyone knew the flood story, and the creation myths, and the tales of the gods in council. This shared imaginative world was not merely decorative, it was functional, providing a common framework of meaning within which the great families could communicate and negotiate and cooperate, even across the differences of local tradition and local interest that might otherwise have divided them. The story of Gilgamesh deserves particular attention in this context, because it is the most fully developed and the most profoundly human of all the literary creations of ancient Mesopotamia, a work that speaks across the millennia to questions that do not change with the changing of empires. Gilgamesh was, according to the king list, a historical ruler of Uruk, though the deeds attributed to him in the literary tradition are far beyond anything that can be verified archaeologically. The stories about him were told and retold and eventually combined into what scholars call the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a composition of approximately 3,000 lines that was copied in the tablet houses of Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years, and that influenced the literary traditions of the ancient Near East in ways that are still being traced. The story of Gilgamesh is, at its heart, a meditation on the desire to escape death, on the friendship between two very different people, on the price of greatness, and on the acceptance of human limitation. Gilgamesh is a king who believes himself to be invincible, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the text's own accounting, a man of extraordinary strength and beauty who drives his city hard in his ambition and his restlessness. The gods, responding to the complaints of the people of Uruk, create a companion for Gilgamesh, a wild man named Enkidu, made from clay and raised among the animals of the steppe, who knows nothing of civilization until a woman from the city teaches him its ways. Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight when they first meet, two enormous forces colliding, and then embrace, becoming inseparable friends, brothers in all but blood. Together they undertake great deeds, killing the monster Humbaba who guards the cedar forest, and slaying the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Inanna as punishment for Gilgamesh's rejection of her advances. But then Enkidu dies, struck down by the gods as punishment for these transgressions, and Gilgamesh is left alone with his grief and his terror, because for the first time he understands that he too will die, that his strength and his beauty and his divine portion cannot save him from the fate that takes every human being in the end. He sets out on a quest for immortality, travelling to the end of the world to find the one man, Utnapishtim, who the gods have made immortal after the Great Flood. He finds Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the flood, and who tells him that immortality is not available to him, that the gods do not give that gift twice, but who tells him also of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth even if it cannot grant eternal life. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea and finds the plant, and he carries it back with him on his long journey home, intending to share it with the old men of Uruk so that they can become young again, and then, perhaps, to eat it himself. But while he sleeps beside a cool pool, a serpent comes and eats the plant, and when Gilgamesh wakes and sees the serpent shedding its old skin, slipping away young and renewed, he weeps. His prize is gone. Immortality is not for him. He returns to Uruk, and the poem ends with Gilgamesh standing before the walls of his city, describing them to his boatmen, naming the materials from which they were built, the kiln-fired bricks, the temple of Ishtar within them, the foundation tablet hidden in the cornerstone, and inviting the boatmen to look at what has been built, to understand that this is what endures, not the life of any individual, not even a great king, but the city itself, the institution, the accumulated work of many hands and many generations. This ending is not resignation. It is wisdom, the particular wisdom of a civilization that had been building cities for a very long time and had learned, through the experience of many collapses and many renewals, that the city as an institution was more durable than any of the individuals who inhabited it, that the knowledge and the customs and the physical fabric of urban life could outlast plague and war and flood and the ambitions of conquerors if the people who carried them were careful and persistent and willing to do the patient work of maintenance and renewal. The great families of Sumer understood this wisdom because they embodied it. They were the ones who did the maintenance and the renewal, generation after generation, and the poem of Gilgamesh was in some sense their own story, the story of people who had learned to accept the limits of individual life and had found their meaning in the continuation of the community. The walls of Uruk that Gilgamesh describes at the end of the epic were real walls. Walls that have been found and partially excavated by archaeologists, walls whose construction is attributed in the tradition to Gilgamesh himself. They are made of fired brick, as the poem says, and they are very old, and they still stand in part rising from the flat plain of southern Iraq, a reminder that the things built by human hands in this ancient place were built to last, and that some of them have lasted longer than their builders could have imagined. The question of what the great families of Sumer believed about themselves, about their place in the divine order, about the reasons for their prominence and the responsibilities that came with it, is one that the tablets address in many different ways, not always directly, not always clearly, but persistently, in the gaps between the accounting records and the legal documents, in the mythological texts and the hymns and the wisdom literature, and the personal letters that have survived. What emerges from all of these sources read together is a picture of a ruling class that took its obligations seriously, that understood power not primarily as a privilege but as a duty, and that believed, with apparent sincerity, that the gods were watching and that the quality of one's stewardship would be assessed. The concept of me, sometimes translated as divine laws or divine decrees, was central to Sumerian thinking about the proper order of the world. The me were the principles and practices that made civilization possible: kingship, priesthood, the scribal arts, music, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from it, the arts of war, the arts of peace. These were not human inventions in the Sumerian view, but divine gifts, attributes that the gods possessed and that they had chosen to share with humanity, or that had been won from the gods by enterprising divine or semi-divine figures. The story of Inanna's acquisition of the me from Enki, the god of wisdom, is one of the most celebrated of the Sumerian mythological tales, describing how the goddess travelled to Enki's city of Eridu, drank him under the table in a contest of beer drinking, and took from him, while he was incapacitated, the full set of divine laws that gave civilization its form and its meaning. The point of the story, and the point of the concept of me more broadly, was that the forms of civilization were not arbitrary. They were not invented by clever people who thought they had a better idea. They were divinely ordered, part of the cosmic structure, and the people who managed them, the kings and priests and scribes and craftsmen who performed the roles that civilization required, were acting out a divine script, fulfilling a function that had been assigned to them from above. This was a profoundly conservative vision of society, one that legitimized the existing order by grounding it in divine intention, and it was exactly the vision that served the interests of the great families, who occupied the positions of power and responsibility that the divine order had established. But it was not merely self-serving. The obligations were real, and the families that failed to meet them could expect divine punishment, as well as human displeasure. A king who exploited his people rather than protecting them, who allowed the canals to fall into disrepair and the temples to go without their offerings, who made war without just cause or made peace when his city needed defense, was a king who had failed in his divinely appointed role and the gods would withdraw their favour, and the city would suffer, and the king's own dynasty would eventually be swept away. The great families understood this logic and internalised it, not always perfectly, not always without the self-deception that comes naturally to those in positions of power, but genuinely enough that the ethical dimension of their authority was more than rhetorical. The river that ran beside the great family's world was also running beside the world of the people they governed, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen and servants whose labour sustained the whole structure. These people had their own relationship to the divine order, their own understanding of their place in the cosmic scheme, their own religious practices and their own small rituals of daily life. They did not leave as many written records as the great families, because literacy was less common among them and the details of their lives were less likely to be written down. But they are present in the tablets nonetheless, as the recipients of rations, as parties to legal disputes, as the subjects of the census records that the administrators compiled, as the workers whose labour is enumerated in the great account books of the temples and the palaces. A day in the life of a fisherman in the vicinity of one of the great Sumerian cities would have begun before the sun rose, in the blue-grey light of the early morning when the air was still cool and the river was calm. He would have risen from his sleeping mat in the small reed house he shared with his wife and children, eaten a quick meal of bread and beer left from the night before, and walked down to the river's edge where his boat was tied, a small craft made of bundled reeds coated with bitumen, light enough to carry on his shoulder if the water was too shallow to float it. He would have checked his nets in the half-light, pulling them up to examine the catch from the night before, untangling the fish and the occasional turtle or waterfowl that had been snared, resetting the nets for the day. The river in the morning was full of sound and life. Herons stood in the shallows, still as painted figures watching for fish. Ducks moved through the reeds with the soft slapping sound of webbed feet on water. The current carried small pieces of debris, twigs and leaves and the occasional dead animal downstream toward the sea. In the distance, across the water, the walls of the city were becoming visible as the light strengthened and the sound of the city waking, the lowing of cattle in the temple herds, the creak of a water wheel, the distant voice of someone calling, drifted across the water. The fisherman would have worked through the morning, moving his boat along the river and the canal, setting new traps and checking old ones, reading the water with the attention of long familiarity, knowing where the fish gathered in the morning cool, knowing where the current eddied and the still water collected the food that drew the larger fish. His knowledge of the river was not written down anywhere. It was held in his body, in the muscles that handled the boat without conscious thought, in the eyes that read the surface of the water and saw beneath it, in the hands that felt the weight of the net and knew from that weight whether it was full or empty before it broke the surface. This knowledge had been given to him by his father and his father's father, passed on in the way that practical knowledge passes, through years of working side by side, watching and doing and correcting until the skill was fully internalized. By midday, the fisherman would have brought his catch to the market or to the temple receiving station, depending on the arrangements that governed his work. If he was one of the independent fishermen who paid a portion of his catch to the temple in exchange for the right to fish the temple's waters, he would have separated out the temple's portion first, knowing from long habit and from the strict accountability of the temple overseers exactly how much was required. If he was a dependent worker of the temple, fishing on its behalf in exchange for his daily ration, the entire catch would go to the temple's storehouse, to be processed and distributed according to the administration's plans. The market, when he went there, was a noisy and fragrant and chaotic place, a concentration of all the different kinds of work that the city's various producers and craftsmen and merchants performed, meeting in the centre to exchange what each had for what each needed. Grain merchants sat behind piles of barley and wheat, measuring out amounts in standard vessels and accepting in exchange whatever the buyer had brought. Fish, oil, wool, clay pots, small amounts of silver in the form of weighed pieces of metal rather than coins, which would not exist for another 2,000 years. Potters displayed their wares, the simple utilitarian vessels of everyday use, the storage jars and the cooking pots and the beer mugs that every household needed. Textile workers sold their cloth, the coarse linen and wool that most people wore, and occasionally a finer piece, dyed with the expensive pigments that only the wealthy could afford. Metalworkers offered their copper tools and ornaments. Jewelers showed their beads and pendants of carnelian and lapis lazuli, imported at great expense from distant places. The noise of the market was the noise of the city at its most energetic, a dense weaving together of voices haggling and greeting and arguing and laughing, of animals moving through the crowd, of the clink of metal and the thump of grain bags and the clatter of pottery. Above it all, on the days when the wind was right, came the smell of the river, and the smell of the baking ovens and the sharp animal smell of the livestock pens at the market's edge, a combination that was as characteristic of this place as any flavour or colour, a smell that every person who grew up in or near this city would carry in their memory for the rest of their life. As the afternoon advanced and the heat of the day reached its peak, the market thinned, the merchants and buyers retreating to their homes and workshops for the afternoon rest that the climate made necessary. The city grew quiet in the long hours of the afternoon, the streets nearly empty, the sounds of work replaced by the sound of the wind moving through the palm trees and the occasional distant cry of a child. Cats moved through the shadows of the alleys, hunting the rats that lived in the grain stores. An old man sat in the doorway of his house, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow, keeping his own kind of watch over the quiet street. In the great houses of the great families, the afternoon was not entirely restful. The senior members of the household used these quieter hours for the work that required concentration and privacy, reading letters, dictating responses, going over accounts, discussing with the household steward the matters that needed attention, the repairs to the canal that fed the family's fields, the shipment of wool that was overdue from the northern estate, the marriage proposal that had arrived from a family in a neighbouring city, and that needed a careful response, neither too eager nor too cool, acknowledging the honour of the proposal while leaving room for further negotiation. The archive of the household was a room set apart from the living quarters, its walls lined with shelves where the clay tablets were stacked in orderly groups, each group tied together with cord and labelled with a clay tag identifying its contents, the accumulated documentation of the family's history and its current affairs. The archive was the family's memory, the place where the evidence of its rights and its obligations was kept, where the title deeds to its land and the records of its contracts and the copies of the legal decisions that had gone in its favour could be retrieved when needed. A family that lost its archive was a family that had lost part of its identity, that was vulnerable to challenges to its property rights and its social position that it might not be able to refute without the documentary evidence. The archives of the great families were therefore kept with great care, maintained through generations, the oldest tablets sometimes crumbling at the edges but preserved nonetheless because the information they contained was still legally and historically relevant. When a new tablet was added to the archive, it was checked against the existing records, its contents noted in the household accounts, its place in the family's documented history assigned. The archive was tended as carefully as the fields. Evening in the great family's household brought the family together in the way that the scattered activities of the day did not allow. The children returned from their lessons or their play in the streets. The men who had been away managing the family's affairs, visiting the temple or attending the court or conducting business in the market, came home through the city gates before they closed for the night. The women who'd been managing the domestic production of the household, the weaving and the bread making and the supervision of the servants set down their work. The household gathered in the central courtyard in the cooling air of the evening, and the meal was prepared and shared. The evening meal was the main meal of the day, the time when the family's food resources were displayed in whatever combination the season and the household's wealth allowed. Bread, always bread, the flat rounds baked on the oven walls, or the thicker loaves from the communal oven down the street, beer in clay vessels, cooled from the storage room, a pot of lentil stew fragrant with onion and garlic, or a dish of dried fish softened in water and seasoned with the herbs that grew in the courtyard garden. In a prosperous household there might be fresh meat, a lamb or a kid slaughtered for a festival or a guest, its smell filling the courtyard from the fire where it roasted. There would be dates, sweet and sticky, and if the season was right, fresh figs or pomegranates from the trees that grew in the wealthier neighbourhoods. The meal was not only nutrition, it was a performance of family solidarity, an occasion when the members of the household affirmed their connection to each other and to the household's divine patron. Before eating, the senior member of the household would make a small offering to the household gods, setting aside a portion of the food and placing it before the images on the household altar, saying the words that the tradition prescribed, words that had been said before this altar by his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, words that tied this meal to all the meals that had come before it and all the meals that would come after. Then the family ate together, the talk moving across the events of the day, the news from the market and the temple, the progress of the children in their lessons, the health of the family's elderly members, the small concerns and small pleasures that make up the texture of any family's life. After the meal, in the soft darkness of the evening, the older members of the family sometimes talked about the past, about the stories that connected them to their ancestors and to the great events of their city's history. An old grandmother might tell the children about the flood she'd seen in her own childhood, the year the river came too high, and the fields were underwater for a month and the granaries ran short before the next harvest. A grandfather might describe his own time in the tablet house, the teacher who had struck him on the hand for malforming a sign, the friend he had made there who was now a high official in the temple administration, and who still came to the house sometimes for the evening meal, because the friendships made in the tablet house were the kind that lasted a lifetime. These stories were the family's own mythology, the narrative of its particular experience of the world, and the children listened to them with the mixed attention of those who are partly bored and partly fascinated, partly restless, and partly aware that something important is being transmitted, something they will need later, when the old ones are gone and the stories must come from their own memories. The night settled over the city of Ur, or Uruk, or Lagash, or any of the other cities where the great families lived their careful, layered lives. The stars appeared one by one, and then in their full multitude, the same stars that the astronomers in the temple were watching from the high platform of the ziggurat, recording the positions of the planets, noting the times of the rising and setting of the stars that marked the seasons, building up the long record of celestial observation that would eventually produce the first accurate calendars and the first predictive models of planetary motion. The night watchmen made their rounds through the streets, calling out the hours, keeping order in the sleeping city. The oil lamps in the houses burned low and then went out. The city breathed in the darkness, its thousands of sleeping people dreaming whatever dreams the night sent them, their bodies warm under their blankets of woven wool, the walls of their houses keeping out the chill of the desert air that descended when the sun went down. In the temple, the night rituals continued, the priests who served the night watches performing the ceremonies that maintained the divine order through the dark hours, burning incense before the statues of the gods, singing the hymns that the night called for, keeping the lamp before the divine image burning so that the god would not be left in darkness. The temple never truly slept. It was a household like any other household, and its divine occupant needed the same attentions that any great lord would require: food and drink and clean clothing and music and the company of servants who were always ready to attend. The priests and priestesses who performed these services were members of families, some of them great families who had provided personnel to the temple for generations, families for whom temple service was not merely a job but a calling, a vocation that ran in the blood, that was as much a part of the family's identity as its land holdings or its commercial networks. The astronomical observations made by the temple priests were not separate from the religious functions of the temple, they were part of them. The movements of the stars and planets were understood as messages from the gods, signs that could be read by those with the training and the knowledge to interpret them. A particular configuration of planets might indicate a favourable time for a military campaign, or an unfavourable time for a business venture, or the approach of a flood or a drought. The king would consult the temple astronomers before making major decisions, and the priests would read the sky and the omens and give their advice, and the king would weigh it alongside the other information available to him and make his choice. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense of the word. It was an attempt, sophisticated for its time, to find patterns in the world, to use the accumulated observations of many generations to make predictions about what was coming, to reduce the terrible uncertainty of life in a world where the difference between a good harvest and starvation could depend on whether the rain came in the right week of the right month. The knowledge accumulated in the temples, the astronomical observations, the mathematical tables, the medical recipes, the omens and their interpretations, the lists of plants and animals and stones and countries and their various properties, was organised and preserved with the same careful attention that the great families gave to their property archives. It was recorded on clay tablets and kept in the temple libraries, copied by successive generations of scribes, updated when new observations or new experiences added to the existing knowledge, cross-referenced with related material, so that a student or a practitioner who needed to find a particular piece of information could locate it in the organized collection. These temple libraries were among the first libraries in the world, and the tradition of organized knowledge preservation that they represent is a direct ancestor of every library that has existed since, a line of transmission that runs from the clay shelves of the Sumerian temples to the stone archives of Assyria, to the Great Library of Alexandria, to the manuscript collections of the medieval monasteries, to the digital archives of the present day. The transmission was never smooth or uninterrupted. There were moments when libraries burned, when tablets were smashed, when the chain of knowledge was nearly broken. The sack of Nineveh by the Babylonians and the Medes destroyed much that had been collected there, though not all, because scribes had made copies and sent them to other libraries, and the knowledge survived in those copies. The conquest of Babylon by Cyrus disrupted the temple organizations for a time, though the Persians were generally careful to maintain the institutions that kept the cities functioning. The conquest of Babylon by Alexander the Great ended the political independence of Mesopotamia forever, but Alexander was interested in the knowledge of the Babylonian astronomers and took care to encourage their work, and his successors, the Seleucid kings, maintained the temples and the schools and the intellectual traditions they had inherited. The last cuneiform texts that have been found date from the 1st century of the Common Era, nearly 5,000 years after the first marks were pressed into clay at Uruk. The final generation of scribes trained in the ancient tradition were writing in a world that had been transformed out of recognition from the world that had created their art, a world now dominated by Greek and Latin, by the Roman Empire, by the new religious movements that were competing for the allegiance of the peoples of the ancient Near East. But they continued to copy the old texts, to make the old astronomical observations, to maintain the old traditions, because they understood themselves to be the inheritors of something irreplaceable, the guardians of a flame that must not go out. When the last of the cuneiform scribes pressed the last of their marks into the last of their tablets and set them aside to dry in the sun, they could not have known that their work would be covered by the earth and lost for 2,000 years, that the knowledge they had spent their lives preserving would be inaccessible to the world, until the archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries began to dig up the mounds of the ancient cities and decipher the strange wedge-shaped marks on the clay. They could not have known that the tablets would survive, that the same clay that the rivers had deposited on the plain, and that the potters had shaped into vessels, and that the scribes had shaped into records would prove to be among the most durable of all human media, outlasting papyrus and parchment and wooden boards and wax tablets, preserving in the earth what was written on it with a fidelity that no other ancient archive can match. What would they have thought, those last scribes, if they could have known? Perhaps they would have found in it a kind of confirmation of what they had always believed, that the knowledge was worth preserving, that the effort was justified, that the gods who had given humanity the gift of writing, and the knowledge of the stars and the understanding of the law had intended for those gifts to last. Perhaps they would have taken comfort in the thought that the words they pressed into the soft clay of the afternoon, the last copies of the ancient hymns and the astronomical observations and the lists of signs and their meanings would one day be read again, that the connection would be remade across the gulf of time, that the flame would be relit from the embers they had buried in the earth. The great families whose history and whose inner lives we have been tracing through this long night's narration were not, of course, the sole authors of the civilization they inhabited. The farmers and fishermen and potters and weavers and merchants and soldiers who made up the vast majority of the population were equally essential, equally part of the story, equally the inheritors and transmitters of the tradition. But the great families were the ones who left the most records, who shaped the institutions, who made the decisions that affected everyone else, who wrote the texts that have come down to us. They are in this sense the visible thread of the story, the part we can trace most clearly through the evidence, and in tracing them we trace the history of the civilization as a whole. The legacy they left is not only in the clay tablets and the ruins of the cities, it is in the patterns of thought and organization that became part of the broader inheritance of the ancient world. The concept of the rule of law, of written codes that apply to everyone regardless of personal power, owes something to the Sumerian tradition of codified law. The concept of organized education, of institutions dedicated to the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, owes something to the tablet houses of Sumer. The concept of professional administration, of a class of trained specialists who manage the complex operations of a large political entity, owes something to the scribes and officials of the Sumerian temple and palace. The concept of long-distance trade conducted on a basis of contract and credit and mutual trust among strangers owes something to the merchant families of Ur and Babylon. These things are part of the world we live in now, so deeply embedded in the structure of civilization that they are nearly invisible, taken for granted as simply the way things are done, their ancient origins forgotten. But they were not always there. They were created slowly and painfully over many generations by people who were trying to solve specific problems in specific circumstances and who found solutions that worked well enough to be passed on and adapted and improved. The great families of Sumer were among the primary creators of these solutions. The people who organized the first large-scale irrigation systems, who developed the first systems of writing and accounting, who created the first law codes and the first professional armies, and the first diplomatic institutions. They did not do these things in the abstract, for the sake of posterity. They did them because they needed to, because the problems were pressing and the consequences of failure were severe. But in doing them, they created tools that would prove useful far beyond the particular problems they were designed to solve, tools that other peoples in other places would find, adapt, and use for their own purposes. The rivers flowed, the stars turned, the clay tablets multiplied in the archives of a dozen cities, the great families tended their estates and their connections and their children and their gods. The centuries passed, one careful season at a time, each one building on the last, each one adding something to the accumulated weight of what had been. And the world that came after them, our world, carried without fully knowing it the imprint of what they had made, the deep structure of organized life that had been worked out in that flat, difficult, fertile, ancient land between the rivers. Let the night deepen now around you, and let the images settle into the quiet mind. The flat plain under the enormous sky, the smell of the river in the evening air, the sound of the stylus moving across the wet clay, the light of the oil lamp on the walls of the archive room, where the tablets rest in their ordered rows, holding everything that was known and everything that was loved and everything that was built, waiting with the patience of clay and time for the hands that will lift them into the light again. There is a kind of peace in knowing that the things worth knowing have a way of surviving, that the knowledge pressed into the earth by those careful hands was not lost, only sleeping, as you are sleeping now, or beginning to sleep, your breath slowing, the room growing soft around you, the day's concerns receding into a comfortable distance. The ancient families of Sumer knew something about sleep too, knew that the night was not empty but full of the work of the unconscious mind, full of the dreams that the gods sent, full of the quiet restoration that makes the next day possible. Rest now, as those ancient people rested under the same stars, on the same turning earth, cradled by the same darkness that has held every sleeping person since the first human being closed their eyes and trusted the night. The rivers of the world are moving in their channels, carrying their silt to the sea as they have always done. The fields are resting under the winter sky, gathering themselves for the next season of growth. The knowledge is safe in the earth and in the books and in the minds of the people who care for it, and in you, who have listened tonight with the quiet attention that is its own form of honor. Sleep easily now, knowing that the past rests beneath the present like the deep layers of a tell, solid and permanent, supporting everything that has been built upon it. The morning will come with its own requirements, its own opportunities, its own small demands. But for now there is only the night and the stars and the slow breath and the ancient, patient river moving in the dark, one quiet current at a time. The light that falls on the ruins of Ur today is the same light that fell on those streets 5,000 years ago, and if you were to stand at the foot of the ziggurat in the early morning, when the air is cool and the sky is turning from grey to gold at the eastern edge of the plain, you would feel something that is difficult to name but impossible to ignore, a weight of accumulated time, a sense that the ground beneath your feet holds more history than any single mind can fully contain. The mud bricks of the ziggurat's lower courses are still there, baked hard by centuries of sun, and if you press your hand against them, you press your hand against something that was shaped by human hands in a world so different from ours that the distance seems impossible, and yet the bricks are warm under your palm and the sun is the same sun, and the feeling of stone against skin is the same feeling it has always been. Tonight we continue our journey into the world of the great families of Sumer, moving now into the deeper questions that their story raises, Questions about how the knowledge they accumulated and the institutions they built managed to survive not just the ordinary disruptions of political change, but the far more profound challenge of the complete transformation of the world they inhabited, the replacement of their language, their writing system, their gods, their political order, and their way of life by entirely new systems that arrived from outside, that overwhelmed the old forms, and that yet, in some deep and persistent way, carried the old forms within them, the way a river carries the memory of every landscape it has passed through in the quality of its water and the composition of its bed. The first great outside transformation came with the Persians, as we have noted, but the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, though it ended Babylonian political independence, was in many respects the gentlest of the great disruptions. The Persians were sophisticated administrators who understood that the most effective way to govern a conquered people was to work with the existing institutions rather than against them, to maintain the temples and the schools and the legal traditions that the people depended on, to give the great families a role in the new order that made cooperation more attractive than resistance. The great families of Babylon adapted with the pragmatic skill that their long experience had given them, finding roles in the Persian administrative system, continuing their commercial operations, maintaining their temple connections, educating their children in the old traditions while also learning the Persian language and the Persian ways that were now the languages and ways of power. The archive of the Murashu family, discovered by archaeologists at the site of ancient Nippur and dating from the 5th century BCE, during the reign of the Persian kings Artaxerxes I and Darius II, is one of the most vivid windows into the life of a great Babylonian commercial family during this period. The Murashus were not a family of royal descent or priestly office. They were business people, specialists in the management of agricultural estates and the financing of agricultural production, lending seed grain and tools to farmers in exchange for a portion of the harvest, managing the irrigation rights on large tracts of land, acting as intermediaries between the Persian imperial administration and the local population who actually worked the land. Their archive contains hundreds of tablets recording their transactions, and those tablets show a family operating with complete confidence in a world that was, technically speaking, under foreign domination, a family so well embedded in the economic fabric of the land that no change of political masters could dislodge them. The Murashus dealt with Babylonians and Persians and Jews and people from many other ethnic and cultural backgrounds, all of them participants in the complex economic world of Persian Babylonia, all of them using the cuneiform script and the legal forms that the Babylonian tradition had developed, all of them operating within the institutional framework that the great families of Sumer and Babylon had built over the previous 3,000 years. The Jewish community of Babylonia, descended from the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had deported from Jerusalem in the early 6th century, was particularly well represented in the Murashu archive, and the names of these Babylonian Jews, some of them Babylonian names and some of them Hebrew names, appear alongside the names of their Babylonian and Persian neighbours in a way that speaks of a community thoroughly integrated into the commercial life of the city, while maintaining its own religious and cultural distinctiveness. The Jewish community of Babylonia is one of the most important threads in the story of how the heritage of ancient Mesopotamia reached the later world. The deportees who were brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in the early 6th century BCE came from a small kingdom on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean world, a kingdom that had been deeply influenced by the cultural and religious traditions of Mesopotamia for centuries, through trade and military contact and the general diffusion of ideas that characterized the ancient Near East. In Babylon, surrounded by the greatest city of the ancient world, they absorbed still more of the Mesopotamian tradition, its legal concepts, its wisdom literature, its flood story, its creation mythology, its astronomical knowledge, and they wove these things together with their own distinct religious insights to produce the texts that would eventually form part of the Hebrew Scriptures, and through those scriptures would become foundational to the religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The story of the Great Flood, which appears in the Hebrew Scriptures in the story of Noah, is so closely related to the Mesopotamian flood traditions, particularly the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the related composition known as the Atrahasis epic, that most scholars are confident of a direct connection, a borrowing or adaptation of the Mesopotamian story during the period of Babylonian exile or in the centuries of contact that preceded it. The details differ, as they always do when a story passes from one cultural context to another, but the structure, the warning given to a single righteous man, the building of a boat, The gathering of animals, the survival of the flood, the sending out of birds to find land, the offering made after the waters recede, these elements are so similar that the relationship cannot be accidental. The wisdom literature of the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the Book of Proverbs and the Book of Job, also shows clear parallels with the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, the proverb collections and the literary dialogues about suffering and divine justice that the Sumerian and Babylonian scribes had been composing for centuries. The questions that the Book of Job wrestles with: why do the righteous suffer? Why does the divine power that made the world allow the innocent to be afflicted? Are the same questions that Mesopotamian literature had been asking since at least the time of the third dynasty of Ur, in compositions that scholars sometimes call Mesopotamian Job texts for precisely this reason. The answers given are different, reflecting the different theological traditions of Mesopotamia and ancient Israel, but the questions are the same, which tells us something important about the universality of the human experience that produced them. The transformation that Alexander the Great brought to the world of ancient Mesopotamia was of a different and more profound order than anything that had come before. When Alexander's armies swept through the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE, defeating Darius III at the battles of Issus and Gaugamela, and entering Babylon in triumph in 331 BCE, they brought with them not merely a change of political masters, but the full weight of Greek civilization, with its different language, its different religious tradition, its different philosophical and scientific outlook, its different aesthetic values, its different understanding of the relationship between the individual and the community, the citizen and the state. The meeting of Greek and Mesopotamian civilization in the centuries following Alexander's conquest was one of the most productive and one of the most disruptive cultural encounters in the history of the world. The great families of Babylon experienced this encounter in the most immediate and personal way. Suddenly, the language of power and prestige was not Akkadian but Greek, and the young men of the great families who wished to participate in the new order had to learn Greek, had to educate themselves in the Greek literary and philosophical tradition, had to navigate a cultural world that valued things their own tradition had not valued in the same way: the primacy of reason, the importance of the individual voice in philosophical argument, the tradition of the gymnasium and the symposium, and the public debate. Some of them made this transition successfully, becoming bilingual and bicultural, moving with ease between the Babylonian temple and the Greek gymnasium, reading Aristotle in the morning and copying cuneiform hymns in the afternoon. Others withdrew into the traditional world of the temple, maintaining the old learning and the old rituals with increasing consciousness that they were preserving something endangered, something that might not survive if those who knew it did not make the effort to keep it alive. The Seleucid kings who ruled Babylon after Alexander's death were generally supportive of the Babylonian religious and intellectual traditions, maintaining the temples and encouraging the work of the Babylonian astronomers, whose centuries of careful skywatching had produced a body of data and predictive technique that the Greeks found impressive and useful. The exchange between Babylonian and Greek astronomy in this period was one of the most significant intellectual transactions of the ancient world. The Babylonian astronomers had developed sophisticated mathematical methods for predicting the positions of the planets, methods based on arithmetic sequences and period relations rather than on geometric models of the kind the Greeks preferred. The Greeks absorbed these methods, combined them with their own geometric approach, and produced the synthesis that would become the foundation of Western astronomy, carried forward by Ptolemy in Alexandria and transmitted through the Islamic world to medieval Europe, and eventually to the scientific revolution. The names of the Babylonian astronomers who made this contribution are largely unknown to the general public, but some of them appear in the Greek sources, transliterated into Greek letters, their Babylonian names barely recognizable beneath the phonetic rendering. They were members of the scribal families, men trained in the ancient tradition of temple scholarship, who had spent decades learning the astronomical techniques that their teachers had learned from their teachers, going back through many generations to the first observers who had begun keeping systematic records of the sky. They were the last representatives of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest temples of Sumer, and their contribution to the scientific tradition that would eventually transform the world was made quietly, in the archives and on the roof platforms of the Babylonian temples, far from the philosophical schools of Athens and Alexandria, where the Greek intellectual world was most visibly active. The Parthians, who replaced the Seleucids as the dominant power in Mesopotamia in the 2nd century BCE, were less enthusiastic patrons of the Babylonian intellectual tradition, and under their rule the great temples of Babylon began to decline, their estates diminished, their schools less well supported, their traditions maintained by fewer and fewer trained practitioners. The last cuneiform astronomical tablets date from the 1st century CE, and the last cuneiform texts of any kind are not much later than that, representing the final output of scribes who had been trained in a tradition that was already clearly dying, who knew that they were among the last, and who continued nonetheless, pressing their marks into the clay with the same care that their predecessors had brought to the same task for 5,000 years. When the tradition finally ended, when the last scribe set down the last tablet, and the clay dried in the sun and the archive fell into dust and was covered by the earth, what had been preserved was enormous. The physical record, the hundreds of thousands of clay tablets in the ruins of the cities, was preserved by the very collapse that ended the civilization, the buildings falling over the archives, covering them with the rubble that would protect them from rain and flood and later disturbance, sealing them in the earth for the archaeologist to find 2,000 years later. But the intellectual and cultural legacy had already been transmitted through the channels of trade and conquest and exile and scholarly exchange to the other civilizations that surrounded Mesopotamia and that would carry it forward in their own forms. The Jews carried the flood story and the wisdom literature and the legal concepts. The Greeks carried the astronomy and the mathematics and certain philosophical ideas. The Persians carried the administrative techniques and the legal traditions. The Arabs who conquered Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE found a land whose ancient traditions had been largely submerged under centuries of Parthian and Sassanid and Byzantine influence, but whose soil still held the buried libraries, whose population still carried in their blood and their habits of mind the deep imprint of the most ancient civilization on earth. The Arab scholars who translated the Greek scientific texts in the Abbasid period were in a real sense completing a circle, bringing back to the land between the rivers, in Arabic dress, the knowledge that the Babylonian scholars had contributed to the Greek tradition centuries earlier. The city of Baghdad, founded by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur in 762 CE on the western bank of the Tigris, stood only a short distance from the ruins of ancient Babylon, on the same flat plain, beside the same river, in the same climate, drawing water from the same system of canals that the Sumerian engineers had first designed. The House of Wisdom, the great intellectual institution established in Baghdad under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his successors, became one of the most important centres of scholarship in the medieval world, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond, translating the Greek and Persian and Sanskrit texts into Arabic, synthesizing the knowledge of many traditions into new and more powerful forms. The scholars of the House of Wisdom worked in a tradition of organized institutional scholarship that had been established in this very region thousands of years before, in the tablet houses of Nippur and the astronomical observatories of Babylon. They did not know this, could not have known it in the way that we can know it now, with the benefit of the archaeological discoveries of the last 2 centuries. But they were nonetheless the inheritors of something ancient, working in the same pattern that the Sumerian scribes had established, accumulating knowledge systematically, preserving it carefully, transmitting it to the next generation. The question of whether the great bloodlines of Sumer, the actual biological descendants of the great families, survived into the later periods and continue in some form to the present day, is one that requires careful and honest treatment. It is not a question that can be answered with any simple certainty, and it is a question that has sometimes been exploited by those with ideological agendas that have nothing to do with historical truth. What can be said with confidence is this: the populations of the ancient cities of Mesopotamia did not disappear when the cities fell or when the empires changed hands. People are remarkably persistent. They stay in the places where they were born, or their descendants return to those places, and even when the political and cultural landscape changes completely, the biological continuity of the population tends to be much greater than the political or cultural discontinuity might suggest. The people who live in southern Iraq today, in the cities of Nasiriyah and Basra, and the towns and villages of the alluvial plain, are the descendants, in some degree, of all the populations that have ever lived in that land. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Parthians, the Sassanids, the Arabs who came with Islam, the many other peoples who passed through or settled in this ancient crossroads. The genetic heritage of the earliest inhabitants is not absent from the modern population, though it has been diluted and mixed with every subsequent wave of immigration and conquest. modern genetic studies of Middle Eastern populations have found evidence of deep continuity in the region, of lineages that go back to the earliest agricultural populations of the Fertile Crescent, present in attenuated form within the much larger and more diverse gene pool of the modern inhabitants. But biological descent, however interesting, is perhaps the least important form of inheritance when we're talking about the legacy of the great families of Sumer. The more significant inheritance is cultural, institutional, and intellectual. The transmission of specific forms of knowledge and specific ways of organizing human life that began in the cities of the Sumerian plain, and that can be traced, with varying degrees of directness, through the subsequent history of civilization. This kind of inheritance does not require biological continuity. It requires only that the knowledge be transmitted, that the tools be used and improved and passed on, that the institutions be maintained and adapted and kept alive. The legal tradition that flows from Sumer through Babylon through the Persian and Greek and Roman worlds to the foundations of modern law is an example of this kind of transmission. The specific rules of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi are not in force anywhere today, and no modern legal system consciously traces its ancestry to the clay tablets of Nippur. But the concepts embedded in those rules, the idea that law should be written down and publicly accessible, that it should apply equally to all persons regardless of personal power, that commercial agreements should be enforceable through a formal legal process, that there should be due process before punishment is applied. These concepts are alive and active in the legal systems of the modern world, and their history goes back, through many transformations and many intervening traditions, to the flat plain between the rivers where they were first worked out. The administrative tradition is similarly continuous. The techniques of large-scale administration that the Sumerian temple and palace bureaucracies developed, the use of written records to track resources and labour, the organisation of workers into hierarchies of supervision and accountability, the use of standardised measures and standardised procedures to make administration consistent and auditable, the training of a professional administrative class in specialised schools, these techniques became the common property of all the successor civilizations of the ancient Near East, and eventually of the wider world. Modern bureaucracy, with all its frustrations and all its genuine utility, is a descendant of the scribal traditions of ancient Sumer, shaped and reshaped by many subsequent civilizations, but carrying within its basic logic the patterns first established on the clay tablets of the ancient archives. The astronomical and mathematical traditions that passed from Babylon to Greece to the Islamic world to medieval Europe are perhaps the most clearly traceable of all the lines of inheritance, because the specific techniques can be identified and their transmission documented through the surviving texts. The sexagesimal number system, the system based on 60 that the Mesopotamian mathematicians used and that gave us the 60 minutes in an hour and the 60 seconds in a minute and the 360 degrees in a circle, is present in every clock and every compass in the world today. A daily reminder of the Sumerian counting system that was first developed to keep track of grain and livestock in the storerooms of the ancient temples. The weight of all this inheritance, the knowledge and the techniques and the institutions and the ideas that flow from the ancient civilization of the land between the rivers into the world we inhabit, is something that is almost impossible to fully appreciate, because it is so pervasive, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of modern life that it has become invisible. We do not think of ourselves as heirs of Sumer when we consult a legal document or use a clock or read an astronomical chart or live in a city organised around institutions of governance and commerce and education. But we are those heirs, and the great families of Sumer, the lineages that built and maintained and transmitted the civilization of the ancient plain, are in some real sense the ancestors of the world we live in. The marshes of southern Iraq, the great reed marshes that had been the original home of the first settlers of the Sumerian cities, were drained in the late 20th century by the government of Saddam Hussein, partly as a political act against the marsh Arab communities who had lived there for centuries, partly for agricultural and economic reasons. The draining of the marshes was one of the most dramatic ecological catastrophes of the modern era, destroying in a few years an ecosystem that had been continuously inhabited for at least 6,000 years, displacing the people who had maintained the ancient tradition of marsh dwelling, building their floating reed islands and their arched reed houses and their reed boats in the same way their ancestors had built them in the time before the first cities rose. After the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, international efforts to reflood the marshes began, and some of the water has returned and some of the displaced communities have come back, and the reeds are growing again in the places where they grew before. The resilience of the marsh, like the resilience of the great families, is a testament to the power of deep roots. Cut the reeds, drain the water, scatter the people, and yet when the conditions return, the reeds grow back. The water finds its old channels, the birds return to nest in the thickets, and the people, or their descendants, come back to the place that made them, drawn by something that is older than any individual life, something rooted in the particular qualities of the particular land, in the smell of the water and the sound of the wind in the reeds, and the taste of the fish from the river. The families that built the civilization of Sumer were not heroes in the dramatic sense of the word. They did not perform impossible feats or overcome supernatural obstacles. They did something quieter and in some ways more remarkable. They kept going. They kept managing their estates and their temples and their schools and their archives and their marriages and their children and their gods, year after year, century after century, through empires and collapses and plagues and floods and the slow grinding of environmental degradation, through the replacement of their language and their writing and their gods and their political order, keeping alive the essential patterns, the habits of careful administration and long-term thinking and the valuing of knowledge that made the continuation of civilization possible. There is a lesson in this, if we are willing to sit with it quietly enough to hear it. The most durable things in human history are not the spectacular ones, not the great conquests or the dramatic revolutions or the sudden flowering of genius, though these have their place. The most durable things are the patient ones, the careful maintenance of knowledge and institutions and relationships across the long spans of time, the willingness to do the unglamorous work of keeping things going, of teaching the children and tending the fields and maintaining the archives and honouring the dead and preparing the living for what will come. The great families of Sumer understood this, not as a philosophy they had worked out, but as a practice they had inherited and refined and passed on, a way of being in the world that was suited to the world they lived in, which was a world that rewarded patience and punished recklessness, that gave its best gifts to those who were willing to work steadily and think long. The stars above the ancient plain are the same stars that are above you now, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is as you listen to this. The constellations that the Babylonian astronomers named and tracked across the centuries of their careful observation are still there, their light travelling toward your eyes across the same distances it has always travelled, unchanged by the fall of empires or the rise of new civilizations or the turning of the long ages of human history. The river of time flows in one direction, carrying everything with it, but the stars stay fixed in their patterns, the North Star holding its position above the pole, the Pleiades rising in the autumn and setting in the spring, the great river of the Milky Way arching across the sky on clear dark nights as it arched above the heads of the Sumerian priests who watched it from the tops of their ziggurats. The patience of the stars is the patience we are invited to learn from the great families of Sumer, not a passive patience, not the patience of resignation, but an active patience. The patience of people who understand that the most important things take time, that the fields must be planted and tended through the whole long season before the harvest comes, that the children must be taught carefully and slowly before they can carry the knowledge forward, that the archives must be maintained day by day, one careful tablet at a time, for the knowledge to survive the generations. This is the wisdom that came out of the land between the rivers, pressed into clay by the careful hands of the scribes, buried in the earth when the world changed around it, recovered by the patient hands of the archaeologists, translated by the devoted minds of the scholars, and now, on this quiet night, carried in words through the darkness to wherever you're resting, a small flame passed from hand to hand across the enormous distance of time. Let it settle now into the quiet place behind your eyes, that warm and ancient light. Let the images come as they will, the flat plain under the enormous sky, the river moving in its channel, the reeds whispering at the water's edge, the oil lamp burning in the archive room, the careful hands pressing the marks into clay, the smoke rising from the temple altar in the cool of the morning, the stars turning above it all, patient and unchanging, keeping their old count of the passing years. The night is deep around you, and the world is quiet, and the long story of the people who first made civilization in the land between the rivers rests now in the comfortable darkness of the past, where all stories eventually come to rest, waiting with perfect patience to be told again. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders and your chest. The ancient families have done their work, and their work has lasted, and the thread they kept alive still runs forward into the world you're living in, invisible but real, the way the roots of the reeds run under the mud of the marsh, unseen but sustaining everything that grows above. Rest now, as the land between the rivers rests in the cool of the night, its ancient soil holding its secrets and its memories in the quiet dark, the stars turning above it as they have always turned, the river moving in its channel as it has always moved, steady and unhurried and carrying everything forward, one slow current at a time, toward the sea that receives all things and keeps them, and in its own deep time returns them to the beginning. Sleep easily now, knowing that what was built in that ancient land still stands in the deep structure of the world you inhabit, that the knowledge is safe, that the flame is still burning, that the patient work of the great families of Sumer is still present in every hour that is divided into 60 minutes, and every circle that is divided into 360 degrees, and every city that organizes itself around institutions of law and learning and commerce and the honoring of something larger than the individual life. The past does not disappear, it only deepens, settling into the foundations of what comes next, holding everything steady from below, as the ancient alluvial soil of the Sumerian plain holds steady the roots of the date palms that still grow along the banks of the Euphrates, patient and deep and enduring, while the river moves on and the stars turn overhead, and the night keeps its long, generous watch over the sleeping world. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over the ruins of the ancient Sumerian cities in the hour before dawn, when the last of the night's coolness still holds the air and the stars are beginning to fade at the edges of the sky, and the east is not yet light but has stopped being entirely dark. It is a silence that feels inhabited, not empty, a silence that carries within it the accumulated weight of all the mornings that have ever broken over this particular ground, all the people who have ever woken in this place, stretched their arms, felt the cool air on their faces and begun the work of another day. The ruins do not speak in words, they speak in a way that is older than words, in the pressure of compressed time, in the texture of eroded mud brick, in the faint geometric lines in the earth that mark where walls once stood and streets once ran and families once lived their full and complicated lives. Tonight we carry the story forward from where we left it, moving into the territories of transmission and transformation, into the ways that the specific knowledge and specific practices of the great Sumerian families travelled outward from the land between the rivers into the broader world, finding new homes in new traditions, taking on new forms without losing their essential character, the way water takes the shape of whatever vessel holds it, while remaining, in its deepest nature, always water. We have already traced some of these pathways, the legal tradition, the astronomical knowledge, the wisdom literature, the flood narrative. Tonight we go deeper, into the specific mechanisms of transmission, into the actual hands and minds through which the knowledge passed, into the lives of the intermediaries who stood between the ancient world and the later world, and who made the connection possible. The first of these mechanisms, and perhaps the most important, was the one we have already spent some time with: the scribal school, the tablet house, the institution of formal education that the Sumerian cities developed, and that proved so durable that versions of it survived long after the cuneiform script and the Sumerian language had passed out of use. The basic model was simple, elegant, and extraordinarily effective. Gather the young people who are to be trained in the management of complex institutions, submit them to years of rigorous instruction in the skills and knowledge they will need, and send them out into the world equipped to do what needs to be done. The specific content of the training changed over the millennia, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic to Greek to Arabic, from cuneiform to alphabetic writing, from mathematical tables pressed into clay to mathematical problems worked out on papyrus or parchment. But the structure, the institution, the practice of formal education as the mechanism for transmitting complex knowledge across generations, this remained, and it remains today, and it is one of the most direct lines of continuity between the world of ancient Sumer and the world we live in. The tablet houses of Sumer produced not only scribes, but something that we might call a literate culture, a culture in which the ability to read and write was associated with social prestige, in which the ownership of texts was a marker of status, in which the capacity to engage with the written tradition was a prerequisite for participation in the highest levels of public life. This association between literacy and status was not a natural or inevitable thing. In many cultures throughout history, writing has been a purely practical skill, used by specialists for specific purposes and not associated with any broader intellectual or social distinction. In Sumer, and in the civilizations that inherited the Sumerian tradition, writing became something more than this. It became the medium through which the culture expressed its highest aspirations, through which its religious and philosophical and literary life found its most permanent form, through which the knowledge of the past was made available to the present, and the present was made accountable to the past. This valuing of the written tradition had consequences that extended far beyond the practical advantages of better record keeping. It created a class of people, the scribes and the families that produced them, whose status was grounded not only in the land they owned or the power they wielded, but in the knowledge they carried, the access they had to the accumulated wisdom of the tradition, the ability to read and interpret the text that governed the religious, legal and commercial life of the community. This was a form of power that was fundamentally different from the power of the warrior or the wealthy landowner, and it was a form of power that proved more durable than either of those, because the knowledge could not be confiscated like land, or destroyed like an army. It could only be transmitted, and as long as it was being transmitted, the class of people who transmitted it retained their essential position. The families that produced the great scribal scholars of ancient Mesopotamia were not always the same families that produced the kings and the military commanders, though there was considerable overlap, and in the most successful families both kinds of capability were cultivated. But the scribal tradition had its own aristocracy, its own lineages of distinguished scholars, whose names appear in the colophons of the tablets they copied, identifying themselves and their fathers, and sometimes their grandfathers as members of a particular scribal family, proud of their intellectual heritage, aware of themselves as links in a chain of transmission that stretched back to the beginning of writing itself. These families understood their work as sacred, as an act of piety toward the gods who had given humanity the gift of writing, and they performed it with the seriousness and the care that sacred work deserves. The city of Nippur, which was the religious center of the Sumerian world and the home of the Temple of Enlil, was also one of the great centers of scribal education, and the thousands of school tablets found in the ruins of the scribal quarter of Nippur have allowed scholars to reconstruct the curriculum of the Sumerian tablet house in remarkable detail. The curriculum began with the most basic elements, the sign list, a long sequence of cuneiform signs that the student had to learn to recognize and reproduce, each sign paired with its name and its meaning. This was followed by the vocabulary lists, long compilations of words organized by category, trees and their parts, animals and their parts, professions and their titles, geographical features, types of stone and metal and cloth. The vocabulary lists were not merely practical references. They were a way of organizing knowledge, a taxonomy of the natural and human world that imposed a structure on the infinite variety of experience, making it manageable and transmissible. After the vocabulary list came the mathematical texts, the multiplication tables, and the reciprocal tables, and the problem texts that trained the student in the arithmetic operations necessary for the accounting work that would be their primary professional task. Sumerian mathematics was sophisticated, capable of dealing with fractions, square roots, and geometrical problems of considerable complexity, and the training was correspondingly rigorous, requiring the student to internalize a large body of mathematical knowledge and to be able to apply it quickly and accurately under the pressure of real administrative work. The problem texts, which presented specific scenarios involving the calculation of field areas, or the distribution of rations, or the volume of earth to be removed in a digging project, were a way of teaching the student to apply the abstract mathematical knowledge to the concrete problems they would encounter in practice. Beyond the mathematical training came the literary texts, the hymns and myths and epics and wisdom compositions that formed the intellectual and spiritual heritage of Sumerian civilization. These texts were copied not only for the purpose of preserving them, but for the purpose of internalizing them, of making them part of the student's own mental furniture, available for reference and reflection throughout a lifetime of professional and personal life. A scribe who had spent years copying the great hymns to Inanna, or the lament for the fall of Ur, carried those compositions inside him, could draw on them when he needed to find the right words for a letter of condolence or a prayer for a sick child, or a meditation on the meaning of a political disaster. The literary training was not ornamental. It was the deepest kind of practical preparation, the furnishing of the mind with the best that the tradition had produced, the creation of a person who could think and feel and respond to the world with the resources of the whole accumulated heritage at his disposal. The graduation of a student from the tablet house was not marked by a formal ceremony in the way that modern educational institutions mark it, but it was nonetheless a significant transition, a moment recognized by the family and the community as the completion of a long process and the beginning of a professional life. The young scribe who emerged from years of training was a person of recognized competence and recognized status, qualified to take on the work that the great families in the temples and the palaces needed to have done, qualified to be trusted with the management of accounts and the drafting of contracts and the copying of sacred texts and the conducting of correspondence on behalf of important people and institutions. He was also, in a deeper sense, a person who had been formed by the tradition, whose values and whose way of seeing the world had been shaped by years of engagement with the best that the civilization had produced, and who would carry those values and that vision into everything he did for the rest of his life. The young women who received training in the temple schools were formed in a similar way, though the specific content of their training was different, oriented toward the musical and ritual knowledge that the temple required of its female personnel. The high priestess of a major Sumerian temple was a figure of considerable power and considerable learning, responsible for managing the ritual life of the temple, for composing and performing the hymns that were sung at the great festivals, for maintaining the relationship between the temple's divine patron and the human community that depended on that patron's favour. The high priestesses of Nana at Ur, some of whom were daughters of the city's rulers, were particularly celebrated, and the hymns composed by one of the earliest of these figures whose name we know, a woman called Enheduanna, who was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, are among the earliest signed literary compositions in human history, texts that scholars continue to study and debate for what they reveal about the religious thought and the literary art of the early Sumerian period. Enheduanna is worth dwelling on for a moment, because her story illuminates something important about the way the great families of Sumer understood the relationship between political power, religious authority, and intellectual achievement. She was installed as High Priestess of Nana at Ur by her father Sargon as part of his strategy for consolidating his control over the Sumerian cities, using the religious prestige of the position to legitimize the new Akkadian imperial order in the eyes of the Sumerian population. She composed hymns in the Sumerian language that are formally sophisticated and emotionally intense, personal in a way that much earlier Sumerian religious poetry is not, speaking in the first person about her own experience of the divine, her devotion to the goddess Inanna, her suffering during a period when she was driven from her position by a rebel, her eventual restoration. These hymns were copied in the tablet houses for centuries after her death, and the tradition remembered her as one of the great literary figures of the ancient world. What Enheduanna's example shows us is that the great families of Sumer, and the women of those families as well as the men, understood intellectual and creative achievement as part of their identity, as one of the things that distinguished them and that justified their position. A high priestess who could compose hymns of lasting beauty and theological depth was not merely a religious official performing a required function. She was a person who had added something to the tradition, who had given the community something it could use and treasure, who had demonstrated through her intellectual and creative work that the divine favour her family claimed was real, that the gods who had chosen her family had chosen well. The connection between power and intellectual achievement in the Sumerian world was not accidental. It was structural, built into the way the great families understood their own role and their own responsibilities. The tradition of female scholarship and female religious leadership that Enheduanna represents was not a brief aberration. It was a persistent feature of Sumerian religious life, present from the earliest periods and continuing in various forms through the long history of Mesopotamian civilization. The Naditu women of old Babylonian Sippar, who have left a rich archive of their own, were members of great families who were dedicated to the temple of Shamash, the sun god, living in a special cloister attached to the temple, managing their own substantial property holdings, engaging in commercial activities, and maintaining their family connections while serving their religious function. Their letters and their legal documents show women of intelligence and determination, fully capable of managing complex affairs, fully aware of their rights and their interests, operating within the constraints of their particular position with the pragmatic skill that the great families bred in all their members. the property rights of women in ancient Mesopotamia were, by the standards of many later societies, remarkably substantial. A woman of a great family could own land, enter into contracts, act as a party in legal proceedings, manage her own dowry and the property she inherited from her parents. Her property was protected by law and by the force of family obligation, and while there were certainly inequalities and limitations in the position of women, particularly in the later periods, the legal and economic autonomy of women in the Sumerian and Babylonian worlds was considerable, a reflection of the practical reality that the management of complex family enterprises required the full engagement of all the family's capable members, regardless of gender. The commercial networks that the great families maintained required the labour and the intelligence of women as fully as of men, because the household was the basic unit of economic production in the ancient world, and the management of the household was the primary domain of the women of the family. The production of textiles, which was one of Sumer's most important export commodities, was largely the work of women, organised in the large weaving establishments of the temples and the palaces, but also in the private households of the great families, where women supervised the spinning and weaving that produced the cloth that could be traded for the metals and stones and timber that the southern plain lacked. A woman who managed a large household's textile production was managing a significant commercial enterprise, making decisions about the allocation of labour and materials that affected the family's income and the family's standing in the commercial community. The trading expeditions that carried Sumerian goods to the distant sources of copper and tin and silver and lapis lazuli were ventures that the great families organised and financed, and the records of these expeditions preserved in the family archives give us a picture of commercial activity that was sophisticated and far-reaching by any standard. The merchants who made these journeys, travelling by boat down the Gulf to the copper coasts of Oman, or overland through the mountains to the mines of Afghanistan, or across the Syrian desert to the timber forests of Lebanon and the silver sources of Anatolia, were not independent adventurers. They were agents of the great families, working under carefully drawn contracts that specified the goods they were to trade, the prices they were to seek, the percentage of the profit they would receive for their services, and the conditions under which losses would be shared between the merchant and the investing family. The contracts that governed these trading ventures are among the most revealing documents in the entire archive of ancient Mesopotamian commercial life, because they show us a level of commercial sophistication that surprises many modern readers who associate the ancient world with primitive barter. The ancient Mesopotamian merchants operated on the basis of credit, advancing goods and receiving payment at a later date when the trading expedition returned. They used instruments that functioned like letters of credit, documents that could be presented in a distant city to obtain goods or services on the strength of the guarantor's reputation. They shared risk across multiple investors, spreading the consequences of a failed expedition among many participants rather than concentrating them on a single unlucky merchant. They maintained long-term commercial relationships across generations, the sons of one family continuing to trade with the sons of another family because their fathers had established the relationship and proved its reliability. The city of Asher on the Upper Tigris, which would later become the centre of the Great Assyrian Empire, was in the early 2nd millennium BCE, primarily known as a commercial hub, the base of operations for a remarkable network of merchant families who maintained trading colonies across a wide swathe of Anatolia. The archives of these colonies, discovered at a site called Kultepe in central Turkey, which was the ancient Assyrian trading post of Kanesh, contain tens of thousands of clay tablets recording the commercial correspondence and the business records of the Assyrian merchant families who lived and worked there. These tablets show us families that maintained their base in Asia while operating commercial establishments in Anatolia, sending goods, messages and money back and forth across the hundreds of kilometers that separated them, managing their affairs through a combination of family members in multiple locations and trusted agents whose loyalty was cemented by long experience and mutual interest. The picture that emerges from the Kanesh archive is of a commercial world that was remarkably similar in its basic structure to the commercial world of much later periods, a world of credit and contract and correspondence, of family firms operating across long distances, of the careful management of risk and reputation that is the foundation of any sustainable commercial enterprise. The people who operated in this world were members of the great families of Asher, families with long traditions of commercial expertise, Families that had been training their sons in the arts of trade for generations, families that understood as a matter of deep experience that the most important assets in commerce are not the goods themselves, but the relationships of trust that make the exchange of goods possible over the long term. The letters in the Kanesh archive include some of the most human documents to survive from the ancient world, not because they are literary in the way that the hymns and epics are literary, but because they are so immediate, so full of the specific concerns and specific frustrations of people trying to manage their affairs across a great distance, without the benefit of any communication technology, faster than a man walking with a tablet tucked under his arm. A wife in Asher writes to her husband in Kanesh that the silver he promised to send has not arrived, and that the children need new clothes, and that the expenses of the household cannot be met without it. A merchant in Kanesh writes to his partner in Asher that the tin they sent was of inferior quality, and that the buyers in Anatolia are unhappy, and that this is not the way to maintain a good reputation. A father writes to his son that he has heard the son has been spending too much time at the festival and not enough time attending to business, and that this is not the behaviour expected of a member of their family. These letters are the voice of the great families speaking across the centuries without intermediary, without the filter of formal literature or religious composition, in the direct and urgent register of people who have real problems and real relationships and real emotions, and who need to communicate about them as clearly and quickly as possible. They remind us that the great families of Sumer and the civilizations that inherited the Sumerian tradition were not abstractions or historical forces. They were people, specific and individual, with all the complexity and all the contradiction, and all the essential humanity that any collection of specific individuals possesses. They worried about their children and their finances. They were irritated by the failures of their business partners and comforted by the loyalty of their friends. They felt pride in their family's achievements and shame at its failures. They loved the people they loved and grieved when they lost them, and they went on anyway, because going on is what the great families did, what they had always done, what the tradition required of them, and what the necessity of life demanded. The connection between the ancient world of the Sumerian great families and the modern world is not merely abstract or intellectual. It runs through the specific institutions and practices that the ancient world created, and that the subsequent history of civilization has maintained and adapted. The modern corporation, with its pooling of capital from multiple investors, its separation of management from ownership, its use of written contracts to govern the relationship between the firm and its employees and partners and clients, is a descendant, through many intermediary forms, of the commercial enterprises of the great Sumerian and Babylonian families. The modern legal system, with its written codes and its professional judiciary, and its emphasis on documented evidence and formal procedure, is a descendant of the legal tradition that Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi codified. The modern university, with its curriculum of established knowledge and its training of professionals for specific social roles, is a descendant of the tablet house. These are not mere analogies or metaphorical connections. They are actual historical relationships, traceable through the documentary record, visible in the specific features of the institutions that persist from one era to the next, carrying the essential patterns forward even as the surface details change beyond recognition. The continuity is real, and it runs deep, and it connects the world of the first cities on the Sumerian plain to the world of the modern city, in a way that should give us pause, should make us think about what we are inheriting, and what we are transmitting, and what we are responsible for keeping alive. The responsibility of transmission is one that the great families of Sumer took seriously, and it is a responsibility that has been taken seriously by every generation of scholars and educators and archivists who has stood in the chain between the ancient world and the present. The archaeologists who excavated the great mounds of Mesopotamia in the 19th and 20th centuries, working in difficult conditions, often in the face of inadequate funding and inadequate recognition, recovering the clay tablets from the earth and bringing them to the museums and research institutions where they could be studied. These people were performing an act of transmission as important in its own way as the acts of the Sumerian scribes who first pressed the marks into the clay, the scholars who learned to read the cuneiform script, who deciphered the Sumerian and Akkadian languages, who spent their professional lives working through the enormous archive of ancient texts to understand what the people of the ancient world had thought and said and done. These people kept the flame alive across the gap of millennia, rebuilt the connection that 2,000 years of burial had broken. The decipherment of cuneiform, which began in earnest in the first half of the 19th century, is one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era, a feat of patient detective work that required the combination of linguistic expertise, historical knowledge, and the willingness to follow a chain of reasoning through many steps without the assurance of any shortcut to certainty. The scholars who worked on it, building on each other's discoveries, sharing their findings and their methods, creating a collaborative international enterprise of interpretation that slowly unlocked the meaning of the ancient marks, were working in a tradition that would have been recognized by the Sumerian scribes themselves, the tradition of the tablet house, of rigorous training and careful transmission, and the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. The knowledge that came out of this decipherment was not merely academic. It changed the way the world understood its own past, revealed the depth and the sophistication of the civilizations that had preceded Greece and Rome, and the other cultures that the Western tradition had long regarded as its primary ancestors. The discovery that there had been cities and laws and literature and astronomy and philosophy in the land between the rivers, 2,000 years before Homer wrote and 3,000 years before Rome was founded, was a revision of the historical imagination on a fundamental level, a reminder that the roots of civilization go deeper than any single tradition acknowledges, and that the achievements of any particular culture are built on the accumulated work of many cultures that came before. The clay tablets that the archaeologists have recovered from the ruins of the Sumerian cities continue to yield their knowledge to the scholars who work with them. There are hundreds of thousands of tablets in the collections of museums around the world, many of them still unpublished and unstudied, still waiting for the scholar who will read them for the first time in 2,000 years and discover in them something that changes our understanding of the ancient world. The work of reading and translating and interpreting these tablets is ongoing, a scholarly enterprise that stretches across generations, with young scholars today learning from older scholars who learned from their teachers, who learned from the pioneers of the field. Another tablet house, another chain of transmission, another example of the great family's most enduring legacy, the practice of passing knowledge from hand to hand and mind to mind across the years. The landscape of southern Iraq where all of this happened is a landscape that has suffered enormously in the modern era, from war and sanctions and environmental degradation and the political upheavals of the last century. The great sites, the mounds under which the ancient cities sleep, have been damaged by looting, particularly in the years of instability that followed the American invasion of 2003, when the absence of effective oversight allowed looters to dig into the mounds and extract tablets and artifacts for sale on the international antiquities market, tearing them from their archaeological context and selling them to collectors and institutions that should have known better, destroying in a few years of greed and negligence the information that careful excavation might have preserved. The damage is real and it is significant, and it represents a loss not only to scholarship, but to the heritage of all humanity, a severing of threads that connected the present to the ancient past. And yet the knowledge is not lost entirely. The tablets that were properly excavated before the looting are in the museums. The published texts are in the scholarly literature. The languages have been deciphered, and the knowledge of how to read them has been transmitted to a new generation of scholars. The chain has been maintained, even if it has been frayed, and the work of recovery and interpretation continues, one careful reading at a time, in the libraries and research institutions of the world, in the patient collaboration of scholars who share the ancient commitment to keeping the knowledge alive. The everyday world of the ordinary people who lived alongside the great families in the ancient Sumerian cities is harder to recover than the world of the families themselves, because ordinary people left fewer records, because their lives were less likely to generate the kind of documentation that survives in archives. But they are present in the record nonetheless, and in the quiet of this late hour it is worth spending some time with them, with the men and women and children who made up the great majority of the ancient cities' populations, whose labour sustained the whole elaborate structure, and whose lives, though less documented, were no less real, and no less meaningful than those of the great families they served and among whom they lived. A woman grinding grain in the courtyard of a house in ancient Ur, in the early morning before the heat of the day made outdoor work uncomfortable, would have been performing a task that had been performed by women in this place for as long as anyone could remember, a task so fundamental to daily life that it had its own rhythm, its own small rituals, its own place in the social fabric of the neighbourhood. The grinding stone was heavy and flat, sitting on a low platform of mud brick, and the woman knelt before it, pushing the upper stone back and forth over the grain in a movement that engaged her whole upper body, the sound of stone on stone and grain, a soft, persistent grinding that was the background music of the Sumerian morning, audible in every neighbourhood, a sound that announced the beginning of another day's sustenance. She would have worked in the company of other women, neighbours and relatives who had their own grinding to do, and the work would have been accompanied by talk, the exchange of news and gossip and advice and complaint that is the social currency of women's work everywhere and in every time, whose son had done well in his lessons, whose daughter was being considered for a good marriage, what had happened at the temple festival, what the price of barley had done in the market, whether the canal inspector had come yet to check the channel that ran along the northern edge of the neighbourhood and that had been silting up since the last flood. These conversations were the connective tissue of the city's social life, the medium through which information flowed from household to household and neighbourhood to neighbourhood, the mechanism by which the community maintained its awareness of itself and its members. The children who played in the streets of ancient Ur while the women ground grain, and the men went to their work in the fields and workshops were children in the way that all children have always been children, curious and energetic and easily absorbed in play, their games involving the same basic pleasures of movement and competition and imagination that children's games have always involved. They played with clay animals that they modelled themselves, pressing the soft mud into rough shapes of dogs and oxen and water buffalo, leaving them to dry in the sun until they were hard enough to serve as toys. They played chasing games in the alleys, their bare feet on the packed earth of the street, their laughter bouncing off the high mud walls of the houses. They sat in groups and watched the older children perform the songs and dances they had learned, practicing themselves, learning without knowing they were learning the cultural forms that would be part of their identity for the rest of their lives. The old people of the neighbourhood sat in doorways and watched all of this, the women grinding, the children playing, the men going about their business, the occasional cart making its slow way down the street with a load of grain or pottery or building materials. The old people had seen a great deal, and they knew things that the younger generations did not yet know, and they shared this knowledge in the way that old people have always shared it, through stories told in the long evenings, through advice given when advice was asked and sometimes when it was not, through the authority of long experience exercised with the quiet confidence of those who have outlasted many of the things that the young people consider permanent. The stories the old people told were not only the great mythological narratives that the scribes wrote down, though those were part of the repertoire. They were also the personal histories of the family and the neighbourhood, the stories of what had happened here in living memory, and in the memory of those who came before, the stories that connected the present to the particular past of this particular place. The year the flood came too high and took the corner of the street, the king who had been a good king and the king who had been a bad king, and what the difference felt like to live through, the grandfather who had been a great merchant and travelled to the Copper Coast and brought back wonders, the grandmother who had been a skilled weaver and whose cloth had been sold in the market and admired for its quality. These stories were the neighbourhood's own mythology, its way of knowing itself and its place in the larger story of the city and the civilization. The sick of the neighbourhood were treated by healers whose knowledge combined what we would call medical practice with what we would call religious ritual, because in the Sumerian understanding there was no clear boundary between the two, sickness being understood as both a physical reality and a sign of divine displeasure or demonic attack, requiring both physical remedies and spiritual intervention. The healer, called in Akkadian the Asyu, the physician, knew the properties of hundreds of plants and minerals and animal products that could be used in the preparation of remedies, and the tablets that record these remedies show a sophisticated knowledge of the natural world and a careful empirical tradition of observing what worked and what did not. Alongside the physician worked the Ashipu, the ritual specialist, who could identify the supernatural cause of the illness and perform the ceremonies necessary to address it, reciting the incantations and making the offerings and performing the symbolic actions that would expel the demon or restore the patient to divine favour. The combination of the empirical and the ritual in Sumerian medicine is something that strikes modern readers as paradoxical, but it was entirely coherent within the Sumerian worldview, which did not draw the sharp boundary between the natural and the supernatural that modern thought takes for granted. The world, in the Sumerian view, was a single whole, governed by a single set of divine principles, and the physical and the spiritual dimensions of any event were not separate layers but aspects of the same reality. A plant that healed a wound was effective because the divine power that governed that plant's properties had chosen to make it effective, and the incantation that accompanied its application was not a separate act, but part of the same healing process, addressing the same divine powers through a different medium. The patient who was healed by this combination of remedies did not distinguish between the herb and the prayer, because both were expressions of the same healing power, approached through different techniques. The music that accompanied the rituals of the temple and the festivals of the city was produced by musicians who were, like the scribes and the physicians, members of a specialized professional class with their own training traditions and their own family lineages of expertise. The instruments of Sumerian music, which we know from the beautiful examples found in the royal cemetery of Ur, included lyres and harps of considerable sophistication, as well as drums and wind instruments. The lyre found in the royal cemetery, with its bull-headed sound box of wood covered in gold and lapis lazuli, is one of the most beautiful objects to have survived from the ancient world, and its existence in a royal tomb tells us something about the importance of music in the life of the court and the temple, about the seriousness with which the Sumerian world regarded the art of sound. The music itself has not survived, of course, the vibrations of the air that filled the temple courts and the palace banquet halls having dissipated into nothingness as soon as the last note was struck, leaving no trace in any physical medium. But the texts that describe musical performances, the lists of instruments and their names, the hymns that were sung to musical accompaniment, the occasional notation that scholars believe may represent attempts to record melodic patterns, these things tell us that the music of Sumer was complex and varied, that it had its own theory and its own canon of compositions, that it was taken as seriously as any other form of knowledge and taught with the same rigour and transmitted with the same care. The absence of the music itself from the surviving record is a reminder of how much has been lost, how much of the living reality of the ancient world is permanently beyond our reach. We have the tablets, which give us words and numbers and legal forms and administrative records and literary compositions. We have the artifacts, which give us the physical objects that people made and used and valued. We have the ruins, which give us the shapes of the buildings and the plans of the cities and the layered evidence of how they changed over time. But we do not have the sound of the voices that spoke the words on the tablets, or the music that accompanied the hymns, or the smell of the incense that burned in the temples, or the taste of the bread that came from the ovens of the ancient city, or the feeling of the air on a Sumerian evening, warm and scented with river water and the smoke of cooking fires. These things are gone, and their absence is a kind of grief, a reminder that the past is not fully recoverable, that even with all the extraordinary evidence that the ancient world has left us, we are always reconstructing, always imagining, always approaching the reality of what was without quite being able to touch it. And yet what we have is extraordinary. The clay tablets that the archaeologists have recovered from the ruins of the Sumerian cities are more than just historical documents. They are voices, the actual words of people who lived and thought and felt in a world so different from ours and yet so recognizably human, reaching across 5,000 years to be heard again. The hymn that Enheduanna composed to the goddess Inanna, with its fierce personal intensity and its breathtaking images of the divine power of destruction and creation, speaks to something real and permanent in human experience, something that does not change with the changing of the millennia. The lament for the destruction of Ur, with its grief for a fallen city that had seemed indestructible, and its meditation on the limits of divine protection, speaks to everyone who has ever watched something they loved be destroyed and had to find a way to go on. The proverbs of the Sumerian schoolroom, with their practical wisdom about the consequences of laziness and the importance of a good reputation and the difficulty of pleasing everyone, speak to anyone who has ever tried to navigate the social world of work and family and community. This is the most intimate of the legacies of the great bloodlines of Sumer, not the legal concepts or the mathematical techniques or the astronomical knowledge, important as these are, but the testimony of human experience itself, the record of what it felt like to live in the ancient world, the evidence that the people who built the first cities and developed the first writing and organized the first complex institutions were people in the fullest sense of the word, with interior lives as rich and as troubled and as hopeful as our own. They feared death and desired love and sought the favor of powers greater than themselves and tried to do right by their families and their communities and often fell short and tried again. They built things that lasted and things that did not last, and they grieved the things that did not last, and they took pride in the things that did, and they passed both the grief and the pride onto their children, along with the fields and the archives and the knowledge of how to read the stars. The stars that the Babylonian astronomers watched from the tops of their ziggurats are the same stars that you can see tonight, if you step outside and look up. The constellations that they named and the planetary movements that they tracked are still there, still following the same courses that they followed in the time of the first watchers, still marking the same seasons with the same reliability that made them useful to farmers and navigators and priests. The Great Bear still circles the northern pole, the Pleiades still rise in the autumn, the planets still move against the background of the fixed stars in the patterns that the Babylonian mathematicians could predict with impressive accuracy. The sky is the most permanent thing in the human experience, the one aspect of the world that changes so slowly that the difference between one human lifetime and another is imperceptible, and it connects us to the ancient watchers in a way that nothing else quite does. When you look up at the night sky, you're looking at the same thing that the priests of Ur looked at when they climbed to the top of the ziggurat in the evening to make their observations. You're looking at the same things that the farmers of early Sumer looked at when they needed to know when to plant and when to expect the flood. You're looking at the same things that the children of the great families looked at when they lay on the flat roofs of their houses on warm summer nights and listened to the stories their grandparents told about the gods who lived in the sky and the heroes who had been placed there as constellations for their great deeds. The sky is the oldest library, the one record that has not been damaged by flood or fire or the looting of antiquity dealers, and it is open to anyone who looks up. Let the sky be the last image of tonight's journey, the enormous dark vault scattered with its ancient lights, arching over the flat plain between the rivers where the first great families built their cities and pressed their knowledge into clay and taught their children to read the stars and kept the canals flowing and the archives growing and the temples burning and the seasons turning in their old reliable rounds. Let the image settle into the quiet mind as you let go of the day and release into the night's rest. The families of Sumer have done their work, and their work is with us still, in the hours on the clock and the degrees on the compass, and the legal forms in the courthouse, and the astronomical charts in the observatory, and the syllabi in the schools, and the archives in the libraries, and the stories in the books, and the stars in the sky. The room around you is growing soft and still. The day's concerns are drifting back from the edge of awareness, losing their urgency in the deepening quiet. Your breath is slower now, and the air is still, and the night holds everything in its large and patient hands, the ancient past and the present moment and the future that has not yet come, all of it resting together in the same great darkness that has always been here, that was here before the first city rose on the Sumerian plain, and will be here long after the last city has returned to the earth from which it came. Rest now. The rivers are moving in their channels. The stars are keeping their old watch. The knowledge is safe in the earth, and in the books, and in the minds of those who care for it. And the great families of Sumer, those patient and enduring lineages that first taught the world how to organize itself, how to keep records and honor knowledge, and maintain the institutions that civilization requires, rest also deep in the layered earth of the ancient plain, their bones mingled with the clay they shaped and the city they built, waiting with perfect patience for the morning that will come as it has always come, steady and reliable and full of the same old light. Sleep well. The past is at peace, and the present is quiet, and tomorrow will carry forward what today has been, one slow and certain season at a time.